The moment I sat down at the head of the Waverly family table, Brielle Tate crossed the dining room and put her palm across my face. The sound cracked through the room before the pain reached me, and every fork, glass, and polite conversation stopped. Brielle stood over me in a cream dress she had no reason to wear at a family dinner, her company badge tucked into her clutch like she wanted both access and deniability. "That seat is not yours, Arden," she murmured, calm enough to prove she had practiced it. I touched my cheek and looked at Grant. He was 3 steps behind her, close enough to see the red mark forming, close enough to say my name like a husband instead of a host managing damage. Brielle added, "Someone had to stop you before you embarrassed Maris." Grant's eyes moved from my face to the chair, then to his mother, and the first words he gave me were, "Arden, why would you make this worse?" That sentence settled harder than her hand. I did not cry, and I did not explain the rules to a woman who had learned just enough of our house to weaponize them. I slid my wedding ring off beneath the table, placed it on the black household binder I had carried for 3 years, and stood with the calm Maris confused for obedience. "If the seat belongs to whoever understands this house," I told Brielle, "then the person sitting here handles what happens after dinner." The room stayed frozen. Maris snapped, "Arden, do not turn this into a scene." But I looked at her without raising my voice. The scene started when your guest put her hand on my face. Grant flinched at guest, not at my cheek. I picked up the binder and walked out. And when Della caught me by the front porch asking if I needed help, I only asked whether tonight's dinner had been paid. By the time I reached my rented apartment near Battery Park, the left side of my face had gone from burning to tight. I locked the door, set the black household binder on the kitchen counter, and stood over the sink until cold water steadied my hands. The mark on my cheek looked worse under the bathroom light. 4 faint lines where Brielle Tate had decided she understood my marriage better than I did. I did not call anyone, because the proof I needed was in that binder. Waiting for the first night, I stopped protecting them. Inside were the things the Waverlys believed happened by good breeding and old Charleston manners. Vendor confirmations, driver schedules, dinner menus, dietary notes for Maris, guest preferences, thank you cards, and texts asking me to handle one more thing before Grant got stressed. I had kept every email because private families forget quickly when the woman doing the work has no title. The binder was not power, and it was not inheritance. It was the machinery under every perfect dinner they had mistaken for tradition. Grant came home before midnight, still in his dinner jacket, with his phone glowing like Maris had been feeding him lines. "You embarrassed my mother tonight," he said, and I almost laughed because my cheek was still swollen. But somehow her embarrassment had arrived first. I asked whether he meant the slap, the chair, or the binder, and his mouth tightened before choosing the safest answer. "Brielle is new. Arden. She does not understand how this family works." I opened the binder to the first page and turned it toward him. His father's note said the person who manages the dinner holds the chair until the evening is closed. Grant stared too long, and that was when I knew he had not forgotten the rule. He had only forgotten that I knew it too. Maris knew. Grant knew. And Brielle did not. Yet she had walked up to me with enough confidence to put her hand on my face. I did not post a reply that night, and I did not call anyone to explain why my face was marked. I scanned the vendor confirmations, saved Brielle Tate's future denial before she could polish it, and forwarded the cleanest copies to the attorney I had used before my marriage. By morning, the Waverly family group chat had turned into a room where everyone spoke over the woman who had been hit. Maris wrote that I had embarrassed the family. 2 cousins sent careful little messages about Grace, and Grant stayed silent long enough for his silence to become its own receipt. Then Brielle posted a story with a close crop of her cheek and the dining room blurred behind her. She wrote that some women think a chair gives them dignity, and that an assistant should not be punished for protecting family standards. She never used my name, Because women like Brielle know how to drop a match without touching the flame. I saved the story, the timestamp, and the replies from relatives who suddenly had plenty to say after spending the dinner pretending my pain was bad manners. The binder sat open beside my laptop while I built the first file. There were emails from caterers, driver schedules for Maris, dietary notes, handwritten table maps, text messages asking me to advance costs, and confirmations showing my personal card attached to problems Grant never noticed. I did not need to make myself sound wounded when the records already showed who had carried the house. The strangest relief was realizing I no longer had to convince them I had been useful. Before noon, I typed one message into the family chat and kept it short enough to sting. I will return to the house this afternoon to settle the responsibilities still standing in my name. Maris replied with a question mark. Then Grant called twice, and Brielle sent nothing, which told me she had finally understood the word responsibilities. I closed the binder, slipped my wedding ring into a small plastic bag beside the photo of my cheek, and remembered the exact night I stopped being their quiet solution. When I walked back into the Waverly house that afternoon, Maris was seated with her spine straight and her hands folded like the victim had arrived late. Brielle Tate stood beside her in a soft blue dress, eyes swollen just enough to sell injury without ruining the effect. Grant stayed near the sideboard, caught between his mother and the woman he had let get comfortable in places she had not earned. I set the binder on the dining table, opened it to the first tab, and let the room look at paper before anyone could perform. The first email was from the caterer, confirming the original menu I had approved 2 weeks earlier. The second was Brielle's forwarded revision, changing the seafood vendor and adding a service fee that had no matching contract. I placed both pages in front of Silas Waverly, and his face shifted from family patience to legal attention before he touched the second sheet. Brielle clasped her hands and whispered, "I was only trying to help Grant because Arden had stopped caring about this house." I turned one page and showed the supplier invoice attached to Brielle's personal email, not the household account Della had used for years. The main course had been downgraded. The fee had been raised, and the final balance still pointed back to my card on file. If you did not know who paid, I kept my voice even. Why did every change you made land on the one bill I always handled? Brielle blinked too fast. And for the first time, her tears looked less like pain than calculation losing its math. Della stepped forward only after Silas asked whether the records matched the kitchen file. She confirmed Brielle had changed the seating cards, removed the printed dietary notes from the pantry door, and told staff that Grant wanted her to learn how the house operated. Grant looked at Brielle then, not with tenderness, but with the first thin edge of fear. When he told her to apologize, I did not move, because I am sorry was not enough from a woman who knew too little to be innocent and too much to be accidental. Brielle did not apologize. She looked at Grant first, then at Maris, and the little tremor in her mouth sharpened into something cornered. "You all wanted me involved until Arden brought paperwork," she said, and the room went still enough for Silas to stop turning pages. Grant's face tightened before she finished, because he knew what people only say out loud when they no longer believe they will be protected. Brielle wiped under one eye and looked straight at me. "He told me you were cold," she said, and my name disappeared from the room before I could move. "He said you never asked where he was, never got jealous, never made him feel wanted anymore." Maris drew in a breath, but Grant did not correct her fast enough, and that pause became the first honest thing he had given me all day. I looked at him across the table where the binder lay open between us. The caterer emails were still there, the revised vendor sheet, the household account notes, every small proof that Brielle had walked into my life through doors Grant had left unlocked. My voice came out quieter than I expected when I asked, "Did you use her to test me?" He glanced down, then back up, and the room did not need a confession when his silence had already signed one. The hurt did not arrive like a scream. It arrived like the clean click of a lock. I finally understood. Because the man I had protected from his mother, his relatives, and his own carelessness had invited another woman close enough to see whether I would break. I had not been cold when I stayed calm through late nights, missed calls, and perfume on his jacket. I had been giving my marriage dignity while he mistook dignity for indifference. I took the attorney's draft from my folder and slid it beside the binder. The language was plain because it only needed to be true. Grant's failure to maintain boundaries with a subordinate had contributed to the breakdown of our marriage, and all reimbursable household costs would be handled through mediation. Grant stared at the page as if the words had embarrassed him more than Brielle's hand on my face ever did. I capped my pen and stood, because the test he designed had finally failed, and I was done being graded by the man who wrote it. The brunch was supposed to prove the Waverly house could run without me. Maris wanted low flowers, silver coffee, and no mention of the binder in Silas's study. Brielle moved through the kitchen like she had been promoted to a life she had rehearsed, correcting menus and smiling whenever Grant looked away. I was not there when Maris tasted the shrimp and pressed a hand to her stomach, but Grant called 20 minutes later with panic in his voice. I came because the question had stopped being marriage and had become responsibility. Grant met me near the back hall and asked where his mother kept her medication, as if 3 years of reminders counted only when he needed them. I opened the shared household folder and showed him the list I had sent months earlier. Maris could not have shellfish, heavy cream, or cayenne, and beneath that file Brielle had written, "I will remember this." Della stood by the pantry door with both hands clasped tight. The printed list had been taped there for months, but only 4 pale corners remained where the paper had been pulled away. When Silas asked where it went, Della looked at Brielle and answered carefully that Miss Tate had called it messy before brunch. Brielle folded instantly, whispering that she only wanted the kitchen to look presentable. Maris sat in the breakfast room looking gray, still too proud to admit the woman she defended had made her unsafe with a menu. Brielle knelt beside her, crying that she did not know, and Maris muttered, "She is not family. Arden. How would she know everything?" I placed 3 care checklists on the side table. 1 for Grant, 1 for Della, and 1 for the home care agency. "If not being family means she was not expected to know," I said, "then she was never qualified to teach me my place." Grant reached for the checklist, but I left it on the table because the missing paper, Brielle's saved reply, and Maris's untouched plate had already said enough for me to leave without explaining. Silas invited me to his birthday dinner 3 days later, not because he had become my defender, but because the house was running out of respectable ways to ignore paper. The Waverly dining room looked smaller without confidence in it, though the same silver was polished and the same portraits watched from the walls. Maris sat stiffly near Grant. Brielle stood behind him in a plain dress, and Della kept her eyes on the sideboard. I brought the binder in a worn leather satchel and felt Brielle's fingers flinch when she saw it. Silas cleared his throat before Maris could turn the evening into manners. "We eat after the accounts are understood," he said, and nobody laughed because the revised vendor sheet was already in his hand. I laid out the emails, the dietary list, the payment confirmations, and the messages where Maris had asked me to handle things quietly. Della confirmed Brielle changed the vendor and removed the pantry list, and Silas confirmed the reimbursement claims belonged in mediation if the family kept pretending they were favors. Maris admitted she had asked me to advance costs under other names, though her voice made every word sound like I had forced her to swallow glass. Grant told Brielle that HR would separate her from his client accounts and from anything involving the Waverly family. And for once, she had no soft answer ready. "I did not know it would go this far," she whispered. But the time-stamped emails were beside her plate. I looked at her and said, "Every time you said you did not know, there was a record showing you knew enough to benefit." Grant apologized in front of everyone, and the room waited for me to reward him for finding the right words. I accepted the apology because refusing it would have kept me tied to the performance. But I told him the divorce papers still needed his signature. Silas stood, pulled back the head chair, and said the person who brought truth had earned the seat. I placed the binder on it instead and walked to the door, because that role had ended before dinner began. Grant signed the divorce agreement after mediation, not because he became brave, but because Silas told him dragging it out would put every email under brighter light. Maris returned what the records made impossible to deny, and the rest went onto a civil payment schedule with signatures instead of whispers. Brielle was removed from Grant's client accounts while HR reviewed the boundary she had pretended was professional, and her written apology arrived without perfume, tears, or witnesses. I saved it beside the records and felt nothing dramatic enough to name. I moved into a small apartment near the water and took consulting work again, but every contract had a scope, a payment date, and a line where my labor stopped. I still knew how to make a room feel cared for, how to remember who could not eat shellfish, how to notice when an older woman was too proud to ask for help. I had not stopped being generous. I had stopped letting people rename my generosity as family tradition. Grant came by once, standing outside my building with tired face he used to bring home after late dinners. Maris hated the new nurse. Della had started taking days off, and the house felt impossible to manage. "It is falling apart without you," he said, and I believed he meant it as love. I told him the house was not falling apart. It had simply stopped using me. That weekend, I hosted dinner for 4 friends at my table, with no seating chart and no one measuring my worth by how quietly I served. Someone asked if I missed the Waverly house, and I looked at the clean plates, warm lamps, and the door I could lock without guilt. I missed the woman who held that house together, but not the table that taught her to sit still. If this story felt familiar, stay with that feeling. Sometimes peace looks like a quiet room, a locked door, and your own name finally belonging to you again. Tell me which moment made you breathe differently, and subscribe for the next story.